Welcome to the 700 Club. It's the day after President Trump and President Erdogan talked Turkey. Well, what we're looking at is a massive, massive whitewash of a dictator. And, you know, that's what's going on. They're whitewashing this guy who is he's being called a good guy when actually he's a thug. Well, what are they talking about the ceasefire? A totally different tale from reports on the ground. Why didn't the president hold Erdogan's feet to the fire for his atrocities? And what blowback could follow their controversial meeting? Here's Chris Mitchell with an inside look.
While some hope President Trump would deliver hard truths to Turkish President Erdogan, instead, he got high praise.
I'm a big fan of the president, I have to tell you that.
At the White House, President Trump also praised the ceasefire inside northeast Syria.
Today, the ceasefire continues to hold, and I know that the ceasefire, while complicated, is moving forward at a very rapid clip.
Yet on the ground, aid workers told a different story.
Well, there's been constant fighting since the invasion. There's never been a ceasefire, not one day. Airstrikes by drones, regular airstrikes, artillery, mortars, Turkish tanks.
A number of international human rights groups have also cited Turkey for war crimes during its invasion. At the press conference, one reporter asked President Erdogan about the plight of Christians who have suffered during the invasion.
The ones remaining on the side of the Syrian territory will see their worshipping practices restored and revived in a special manner. They're receiving health care, they're receiving humanitarian aid in every aspect possible.
My name is Omar Firaz.
Yet this Christian leader in the Syrian city of Kobani tells a different tale.
Under the pretext of fighting against the Kurds, a lot of churches have been targeted and destroyed, and many Christians were forcibly displaced from their hometowns.
Something is happening in Turkey that I hope President Trump and President Erdogan had a very frank discussion on.
Given the abuses during its ongoing invasion, human and religious rights abuses inside Turkey, and a NATO member buying Russian military equipment, Senator James Lankford questioned the future of the Turkish-U.S. relationship.
We've had an economic relationship, a military relationship, a genuine friendship with Turkey. But we do not know who Turkey is anymore. We don't recognize the Turkey of today from Turkey 5 years ago.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say this in the strongest possible terms. The White House is a bully pulpit. What is spoken there has reverberations around the world. And for the President of the United States to look at a thug who's a killer and a stone-cold killer and say he's a, quote, good guy, and, you know, he's not a good guy. He's a thug. Chris Mitchell joins us now for more on the reaction to Erdogan's White House visit. Chris, you just showed what really is happening on the ground. Why would the president say he's a, quote, fan of this dictator?
You know, Pat, that's a question that people here in the region has been asking probably since last December, when the first time that President Trump said he was going to pull out U.S. troops. You know, he has been a thug, as you say. He's a dictator inside his own country. I think one thing people need to understand, Pat, is that what Erdogan talked about yesterday was repatriation. And what does he mean by that? Right now, his Free Syrian Army, these jihadist allies of the Turkish army, are driving people out from their homelands. Some of these are Christians that have been there. These are ancestral lands. They speak the language of Jesus, Aramaic. They're being driven out so that others can come in, mainly probably allies of jihadists. Where you and I come from, they don't call this repatriation. They call this ethnic cleansing. And that's exactly what happened yesterday, Pat. While President Trump was calling Erdogan a great guy, there were people literally fleeing for their lives in a place called Tel Tamir, which is a predominantly Christian village.
Chris, what about the Kurds? Are they really trying to ethnically cleanse those Kurds and destroy them?
Exactly. That's exactly what they're trying to do. This is, you know, a lot of the people, when we were there earlier this year, Pat, we heard stories of people that say, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, they came to this land because of the Armenian genocide. almost to a person, the people we talked to said the #1 threat they had at the time was a Turkish invasion. That was forestalled till October 9th, but they were predicting then exactly what's happening now, ethnic cleansing. And they saw also in March of 2018, this Syrian Free Army that's allied with the second largest army in NATO, ethnically cleanse people, burn churches, hunt down Christians. And so that's exactly what they feel is happening right now, ethnically cleansing, not just the Kurds, but also Christians, Yazidis, Arabs, and other ethnic minorities in this region. And that's what we're seeing today.
Chris, what about ISIS? We understand a number of those ISIS fighters are being released. Are they being given safe haven by the Turks?
You know, this is one thing I'm hearing from the sources on the ground, Pat, is that if the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, this is the Kurds and other ethnic groups fighting alongside against the Turkish army, they're saying if the SDF falls, then it's likely then ISIS could be the release. There's tens of thousands of prisoners, up to 70,000 or more. They're saying if they're released, that's going to lead to a resurgence of ISIS in the region. One of these camps is just a few miles away from the Iraqi border, and we know what's happening inside Iraq right now. The Anbar province was a hotbed of ISIS years ago, and they're predicting if it happens, it could be a resurgence of ISIS. And Pat, one other thing, believe it or not, in this Free Syrian Army, or the Syrian National Army, fighting alongside the Turks, there's documented members of ISIS that are fighting there. And so it seems disingenuous when Recep Erdogan says they are fighting the war on terror.
One last question. What's this going to do with Israel? You have many contacts with the Israelis. Are they afraid of the expansion of Turkey?
Definitely, and I think they realize what Erdogan's ambitions are. You know, when this all started, he called this army the Army of Mohammed, and they said that they were coming against the unbelievers. And I think Israel is concerned about the greater ambitions of Erdogan right now. You know, he wants a greater Turkey. You can see that on some of the maps that have been released by even his defense minister. And so I think in the long term, they see Turkey certainly as an enemy. And as Senator Langford said, the Turkey of 5 years ago is not the Turkey of today. So I think Israel and people in the region, especially those people in northeast Syria, are seeing Turkey perhaps exposed the way it really is.
Chris Mitchell, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, when I was in Korea a long time ago, there was a Turkish group, and they were fighting bravely alongside the Americans. They were wonderful fighters, and they were our strong allies. And Ataturk is the one who brought the modern Turkey into being. And they said, I'm a child of Ataturk. Well, they had what were called the Young Turks. And it was remarkable what that economy had accomplished. Now we've got what looks like a Muslim dictatorship taking over Turkey and being used to ethnically cleanse the Middle East. And here we have the President of the United States having that man as a honored guest in the White House saying he's a, quote, good guy. Makes me sick at my stomach. Well, in other news, no smoking gun. Democrats kicked off their public impeachment inquiry on Wednesday, and some say it was a real snoozer. Ephraim Graham has more on this story from our CBN newsroom. Here's Ephraim.
Pat, now that the impeachment inquiry is out in the open, what did we find out? Well, that depends on who you ask. Democrats and the media call it a bombshell. Republicans say it's just more of the same. Jenna Browder brings us the story now from Washington.
Democrats are trying to make their case to the American people. And while it was a long, drawn-out process with little new information yesterday, we did learn about another phone call.
Could not be explained. It was crazy.
U.S. diplomat in Ukraine Bill Taylor and senior State Department official George Kent both testified that President Trump ordered nearly $400 million in military aid withheld from Ukraine for political purposes. Then came that revelation from Taylor. He said one of his staffers overheard EU Ambassador Gordon Sondland on the phone with President Trump.
The member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden.
President Trump says he doesn't remember the conversation.
I know nothing about that. First time I've heard it. The one thing I've seen that Sondland said was that he did speak to me for a brief moment, and I said no quid pro quo under any circumstances, and that's true.
On the Biden corruption front, Kent said he was concerned about the vice president's son's role at a Ukrainian gas company.
There was the possibility of a perception of a conflict of interest.
Republicans focused on the end result, that the White House did release military aid to Ukraine, and there was no investigation into the Bidens. They also noted that Taylor and Kent are relying on secondhand information.
Ambassador, you weren't on the call, were you?
I did not.
You never met the president?
That's correct.
What stood out to you today?
One word, hearsay. We heard it all the time. If we're going to play this game of telephone, I heard it from that person who heard it from that person. Now we're into fourth hand. What in the world does that mean?
CBN's chief political analyst, David Brody, on the network's Faith Nation.
I'll be honest with you, I thought it was a bit of a snoozer today.
And Taylor Staffer, who says he overheard that phone call, will testify privately tomorrow. Also taking the stand publicly is former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
And the hearing continues. Pat?
Well, without question, the thing is rigged. Schiff has gotten the candidates he wants. He's probably rejecting some of the ones the Republicans want. They want to interview the Biden's son to find out about Burisma and some of the money that's been given to him by the people over there in the Ukraine. You know, there's no question Russia invaded Ukraine. They took over a whole part of the country and nationalized it into Russia. They did bad things, and the Obama administration sent no lethal aid to help those people in the Ukraine trying to resist Russian aggression. Trump has done just the opposite. He has released military aid to them, missiles that they need. He's also let go all that humanitarian aid that they were talking about. It wasn't a question of withholding. It's come forth. He let it all go. So what is impeachable? They haven't gotten any impeachable, in my opinion. But from what word we get is that there's going to be a trial in the Senate. Mitch McConnell said, not only is it going to be a trial, but we're going to have it during January and maybe February. So in case any of those senators think they're going to run in Iowa and other states for the presidency, they will not be able to do it because we're going to hold them in Washington to hear the, quote, trial that's going to take place. I thought the Democrats wouldn't have the intestinal fortitude to actually vote impeachment, and they still haven't done it yet, so we'll see. Ephraim?
Pat, less than an hour after an announced ceasefire, Islamic Jihad launched more rockets from Gaza towards southern Israel. The terrorist group has fired off about 450 rockets in the past 2 days, some reaching as far as Tel Aviv. The Iron Dome defense system has kept most of them from striking populated areas, though there have been some injuries. More than 30 Palestinians, many of them militants, have been killed in Israeli airstrikes on terrorist positions in Gaza. Islamic Jihad launched the attacks after Israel took out its leader in Gaza in a targeted strike. That happened on Tuesday. Pat?
I don't see how Israel is going to restrain itself from invading Gaza and cleaning out. It's now, it wasn't a question of the Palestinians taking over. Hamas has taken over. They're in charge of it, a vicious insurgency, and Israel cannot permit the continued rocket fire into their home country. They can't let that happen. So I think we're going to see something pretty soon. Unless I miss my guess, because right now the Israelis are in a state of flux in relation to the election. But I think Benny Gantz in his party and Netanyahu and Likud, I think they'll come together and probably reclaim Gaza. It's going to happen. You know, a few years ago, I mean, a few decades ago, Venice was the key city in Europe. You know, Marco Polo, who went to China, was from Venice, and Venice was the queen city of all the states of Italy. Well, something bad is happening over in Venice, and let's show you those pictures. They're very impressive. Ephraim?
Pat, a state of emergency in Venice, Italy, as rising water overtakes the city. tourists floating their suitcases down city streets, and water flowing through the 1,200-year-old St. Mark's Basilica. The square outside, a swimming pool. Venice is used to seasonal flooding, but the mayor says they haven't seen the water rise this high in more than 50 years. The disaster is blamed for 2 deaths. Pat?
Well, thank you very much. And it's one of those tragedies, and they say it's global warming. I'm not sure what it is, but nevertheless, the floods are there. And Venice, well, it's had a fabled history, and maybe it's coming to an end.